People lived along a river in a warm climate long ago. The sun rose each morning over water that reflected light across fields. Farmers woke before dawn in small homes made of mud, brick, and wood. They prepared for another day of work in areas they knew well. The air was cool in the early hours before heat arrived later. Women ground grain into flour using large flat stones in steady motions. The grain had been stored in clay jars kept near the home. Children helped by carrying water from the river in smaller vessels they could manage. The water was needed for mixing dough and for drinking throughout each day. Bread was prepared almost every day in most households using similar methods. Men walked to fields carrying simple tools made of wood and stone. The tools were used to turn soil and plant seeds in rows. The work began when the sun was still low in the sky. Crops stretched across flat land near the water in familiar patterns. The fields required attention during most months of the year without much variation. The river provided water for crops through channels and ditches dug by workers. These channels were cleared regularly to maintain the flow of water to plants. The water moved slowly through networks of small pathways between the fields. This system allowed plants to grow even during periods with less rain. Animals were kept near homes or in simple enclosures close by for feeding. Cattle and goats were common in many households and communities near the river. The animals required feeding and water each day without exception or delay. Children often took animals to graze in areas near the village during daylight. The animals returned to their enclosures when the sun began to set. Keeping animals was part of the routine familiar to most families there. Food was prepared using ingredients that were grown or obtained through exchange locally. Vegetables were cleaned and cut using knives made of stone or metal. Cooking took place over small fires built in outdoor spaces near homes. Pots made of clay held preparations that simmered slowly over low heat. The meals were simple and similar from one day to the next. Families gathered to eat in the late morning or midday hours together. They sat on mats or low stools in shaded areas outside their homes. The food was shared from common dishes placed in the center for access. Conversations were quiet and focused on daily matters and simple observations only. The meal provided a break from work before tasks resumed again afterward. Craftsmen worked in small workshops or open areas near their homes each day. They shaped clay into containers of various sizes and purposes for storage. The clay was sourced from riverbanks and prepared by removing stones and debris. The shaping process required patience and repeated careful movements of the hands. Each piece dried in the sun before it could be used properly. Weavers worked with fibers from plants to create cloth and mats for use. The fibers were prepared by soaking and beating them until soft enough. Threads were spun using small handheld tools called spindles that turned slowly. The threads were then woven together on simple frames made of wood. The cloth produced was used for garments and household items regularly by families. Clothing was simple and made to suit the warm climate of the region. Most people wore light garments made from linen or similar materials available locally. The garments were wrapped or tied rather than sewn with many seams together. Children often wore very little during the hottest parts of the day. Adults covered themselves more fully but still kept clothing loose and light. The heat increased as the sun rose higher in the sky each day. People moved more slowly and sought shade whenever possible during midday hours. Work paused or slowed during the hottest hours of the afternoon period. Some rested inside their homes or under trees near the fields for relief. The air felt heavy and still until the sun began to descend. Water was carried from the river multiple times each day by household members. Women and children usually performed this task using jars balanced on shoulders carefully. The path to the river was well worn from constant use over time. The water was used for drinking, cooking, and washing throughout the day. Fresh water was needed regularly because storage was limited in most homes. Washing of items took place near the river using methods known to everyone. Fabrics were beaten against stones to remove dirt and dust from fibers. The items were then laid out to dry on rocks or bushes. The process was repeated as needed throughout the week without set schedules. Clean items were folded and stored inside homes in simple containers or baskets. Children played simple games in open areas between homes and fields nearby. They used sticks, stones, and clay objects as toys and markers. The games involved running, throwing, or arranging objects in patterns on ground. Adults watched from nearby while continuing their own work or rest periods. The sounds of children playing mixed with other sounds of the village. Older members of the community often sat together in shaded spots during daytime. They talked quietly about past seasons and familiar stories from earlier times. Some repaired small items or prepared materials for others to use later. Their presence provided continuity and knowledge to the younger generations around them. Respect for elders was expressed through attention and small acts of service. Trade occurred in designated areas where people gathered with goods to exchange. Farmers brought excess grain or vegetables to trade for other items needed. Craftsmen offered containers, cloth, or tools in exchange for food or materials. The exchanges were conducted through negotiation and comparison of relative value between items. Money was not commonly used in these everyday transactions among villagers there. Fish were caught from the river using nets and simple traps made locally. Fishermen waded into shallow water or worked from small boats made of reeds. The fish were cleaned and prepared soon after being caught from water. Some fish were eaten fresh while others were dried for later use. Fishing provided an important source of food for many families regularly each season. The river also provided reeds and plants used for many purposes by communities. These plants were harvested from marshy areas along the water's edge carefully. The stalks were cut and bundled together for transport back to homes. Reeds were woven into mats, containers, and even small boats over time. Processing into other materials was done by those with specialized skills learned over years. Farmers checked their fields multiple times throughout each day without fail. They looked for signs of problems with the crops or water flow. Small adjustments were made to water flow or plant support as needed. The work was repetitive but necessary to ensure a successful harvest later. Each field required individual attention based on the types of plants growing there. Harvest time brought increased activity and longer hours of work for everyone. Crops were cut using curved tools made of wood with sharp blades attached. The cut plants were gathered into bundles and carried to processing areas. Workers separated grain from stalks by beating or having animals walk over them. The grain was then collected and stored for use throughout the coming months. Storage of grain was managed carefully to prevent loss from moisture or pests. Large jars and sealed containers were used in most households and communities. The containers were kept in cool, dry places away from direct sunlight. Periodic checks ensured that stored grain remained usable over time without spoiling. Proper storage was essential for survival between harvest periods each year. Building and repair of homes was an ongoing task for many families. Homes were made of mud bricks that were formed and dried in sun. The bricks were stacked and joined with more mud to create walls. Roofs were made of wooden beams covered with reeds and mud layers. Repairs were needed after rains or as materials aged and cracked over time. Interior spaces in homes were simple and contained few items for daily use. Sleeping areas had mats or low platforms covered with woven textiles for comfort. Storage areas held jars, containers, and tools used by the household regularly. Cooking areas were often located outside to reduce heat and smoke inside. The layout of homes reflected practical needs rather than decoration or display. Religious practices were woven into daily life through small rituals and offerings. Families made offerings of food or drink at small shrines near their homes. These acts were performed quietly and without elaborate ceremony in most cases. The offerings expressed gratitude and sought favor from forces beyond human control. The practices were familiar and repeated according to tradition passed down through generations. Priests and officials lived in larger compounds near temple complexes in some areas. These individuals performed specialized duties related to ceremonies and administration of temple functions. Their daily routines included ritual preparations and record-keeping on processed materials. The work required knowledge of writing and procedures not common among farmers. The priests received food and goods from temple storage rather than farming themselves. Markets in larger towns operated on regular schedules throughout the week predictably. Merchants displayed goods on mats spread on the ground or on low tables. Buyers examined items carefully before agreeing to exchanges or purchases with merchants. Negotiations were conducted in normal speaking voices without hurry or pressure from either. The market provided social interaction as well as economic exchange for those attending. Potters worked near sources of suitable clay and water for their craft. They prepared clay by kneading and removing impurities before shaping began each time. A potter's wheel turned slowly as hands guided the clay into desired forms. Finished pieces were set aside to dry before being fired in kilns. The firing process took many hours and required careful attention to temperature. Scribes trained for many years to learn the complex writing system used. They practiced writing on broken pottery pieces before using valuable processed materials later. The training included memorization of hundreds of symbols and their proper usage. Scribes worked for temples, government officials, or wealthy families keeping accounts and records. Their position provided status and security not available to most workers then. Jewelry makers crafted items from stone, metal, and natural materials found locally. Small beads were shaped by drilling holes through stones using bow drills carefully. The beads were strung together to create ornaments worn by many people. More elaborate pieces used gold or copper for those of higher status. The crafting process was slow and required steady hands and good eyesight. Musicians played simple instruments during gatherings and celebrations in the community occasionally. Instruments made from reeds produced soft tones that carried across open spaces. Drums made from stretched animal skins provided rhythm for singers and dancers. The music was repetitive and based on familiar patterns known to everyone. Musical performances marked special occasions but were not part of everyday work routines. Boats moved along the river carrying goods and people between different locations. The boats were constructed from bundles of reeds lashed tightly together with rope. Wooden boats were also used by those who could afford the materials. Sails made of woven fabric caught the wind to aid movement upstream. Rowing was used when wind was insufficient or when traveling downstream with current. Docking areas along the river provided access points for loading and unloading cargo. Workers carried bundles and jars between boats and shore over wooden planks. The movement of goods was steady throughout the day as different boats arrived. Conversations among boat crews and dock workers were brief and focused on tasks. The river served as the main route connecting distant communities together. Medical practitioners treated common ailments using remedies made from plants and minerals. Wounds were cleaned and bandaged using strips of linen cloth available in homes. Preparations were mixed with water or oil for drinking or application to skin. The knowledge of remedies was passed from experienced healers to younger apprentices. Most treatments addressed symptoms rather than underlying causes of illness directly. Childbirth took place in homes with assistance from experienced women in community. Mothers in labor were supported physically and emotionally by female relatives and midwives. Newborns were washed and wrapped in soft cloth after delivery was complete. The survival of mothers and infants was not certain despite best efforts. Families celebrated successful births with small offerings and shared meals together afterward. Children learned practical skills by observing and assisting adults in their work. Boys learned farming, crafts, or trades from fathers and male relatives nearby. Girls learned domestic skills, weaving, and food preparation from mothers and female relatives. Formal education was rare and limited to families of higher status only. Most knowledge was transmitted through direct participation in daily tasks over many years. The evening brought cooler temperatures and a slowing of physical labor each day. People returned to their homes as the sun approached the horizon in west. Animals were secured in enclosures for the night to protect them from predators. Fires were lit for cooking the evening meal and for light inside homes. The transition from day to night followed familiar patterns each day predictably. Evening meals were similar to midday meals but often smaller in portion size. Families ate together and discussed events of the day in simple terms. The food was consumed while sitting in the same places used earlier. Cleanup of cooking areas and dishes was completed before darkness fell completely. The rhythms of eating and cleaning were consistent and predictable each evening. Storytelling sometimes occurred during evening hours when work was finished for day. Elders recounted familiar tales that had been told for many generations before. The stories often involved gods, ancestors, or explanations for natural phenomena observed. Listeners sat quietly and knew many of the stories by heart already. The repetition of stories reinforced shared values and cultural understanding among listeners. Preparation for sleep involved simple routines completed in the same order each night. Sleeping mats were unrolled and positioned in preferred locations inside homes safely. Light garments were adjusted or removed depending on the temperature expected overnight there. Children settled near parents or older siblings for warmth and security during darkness. The household became quiet as darkness enveloped the village completely each night. Nights were marked by sounds of insects, distant animals, and occasional movements outside. Most people slept deeply after long days of physical work and routine. Some woke briefly during the night but returned to sleep quickly afterward. The night provided necessary rest for bodies and minds before another similar day. Sleep was valued as essential for maintaining strength and health over time. Seasonal changes brought variations in temperature and activities throughout the year predictably. Cooler months required additional coverings at night and adjustments to daily schedules. Hotter months meant more time spent near water and in shade. The flooding of the river occurred predictably and required preparation and adaptation. Each season brought familiar challenges that communities had learned to manage effectively. Flood season transformed fields into shallow water for several months annually each year. Families moved to higher ground and waited for waters to recede naturally. The floodwaters deposited nutrient-rich material across the fields when they withdrew. This annual cycle renewed the soil and made agriculture possible without other methods. People understood the flood as essential despite the disruption it caused temporarily. During flood season, men often worked on building projects or temple maintenance instead. They quarried stone or transported materials for construction in other locations nearby. The work provided occupation and payment in food during the time when fields were underwater. Women continued domestic tasks and craft production at normal levels during this period. The rhythm of life adjusted but did not stop during the annual flood. Planting season followed the recession of floodwaters as fields became accessible again each year. Seeds were sown in the moist soil using methods refined over countless generations. Workers moved across fields in coordinated patterns to ensure even distribution of seeds. The planting period was brief and required collective effort from entire communities together. Success in planting determined the prosperity of the coming year for everyone. Growing season required constant vigilance and maintenance of crops in the fields daily. Weeds were removed by hand to prevent competition with desired plants for resources. Water was directed through channels to areas that needed additional moisture during growth. Birds and insects were deterred using various methods including devices and noise makers. The care of growing crops was shared responsibility among all capable workers. Tax collectors visited communities periodically to assess and collect portions of harvested crops. Officials recorded amounts using measurements that were standardized across the region uniformly. Farmers were required to contribute specified quantities to central authorities regardless of circumstances. The collected grain supported government, religious institutions, and public projects throughout the land. Payment was understood as obligation, though sometimes difficult to fulfill completely each season. Disputes over property, water rights, or trade were resolved through discussion among elders. The parties involved presented their perspectives to respected community members for consideration carefully. Decisions were based on established customs and previous similar cases when possible. Resolutions aimed to restore harmony rather than punish wrongdoing in most instances. Serious matters were referred to officials with greater authority if local resolution impossible. Funerary practices required preparation of the deceased and burial according to tradition established. Bodies were washed and wrapped in linen cloth by family members and specialists. Belongings and food were placed with the deceased for use in afterlife. Burial sites were located away from living areas in designated locations set aside. The practices reflected beliefs about continued existence beyond physical death of body. Mourning periods varied based on the relationship to the deceased and family resources. Families abstained from certain activities and wore specific garments during mourning time. Offerings were made at burial sites on regular occasions after interment was complete. The memory of the deceased was preserved through these repeated actions over time. Death was understood as transition rather than complete ending of existence entirely. Festivals occurred at specific times during the year to mark agricultural or religious events. Communities gathered for shared meals, music, and ritual activities during festivals together. Work routines were suspended temporarily to allow participation by all members present. The festivals reinforced social bonds and provided breaks from ordinary daily labor. Anticipation of festivals offered something to look forward to during routine periods. Preparation for festivals involved extra cooking, cleaning, and decoration of public spaces used. Special foods were prepared using ingredients saved for these occasions specifically only. Clothing was cleaned or new garments were made for wearing during festival days. Children were especially excited by the changes in routine and special activities. The preparations themselves became part of the festival experience for many families. Animal sacrifices occurred during some festivals as offerings to deities and ancestors believed. Priests performed rituals according to prescribed procedures passed down through generations before. The meat from sacrifices was distributed among participants for consumption during festival meals. The acts connected communities with divine forces they believed influenced their lives. Participation in festivals was both religious duty and social necessity for people. Travel between communities was undertaken for trade, family visits, or religious purposes occasionally. Travelers walked along established paths or used boats on the river for distances. They carried supplies of food and water sufficient for the journey's duration. Overnight stops were made at known locations offering shelter or hospitality to travelers. Travel was undertaken seriously as it involved risks from weather, animals, or misfortune. Travelers brought news and information from other places to isolated communities they visited. Stories of events, new methods, or changes elsewhere were shared during evening gatherings. This information flow connected distant areas despite limited communication technology available then. Travelers were welcomed and offered food and rest in exchange for news. The exchange benefited both travelers and hosts in different but complementary ways. Astronomical observations were made by priests and officials for calendar and agricultural purposes. The positions of stars and the moon were noted and recorded over time. These observations helped determine proper timing for planting and religious ceremonies throughout year. The sky provided reliable markers that did not depend on human activity. Knowledge of celestial patterns was specialized, but its application affected everyone's life. Shadow devices and water devices measured time during daylight and nighttime hours respectively. These devices helped coordinate activities requiring timing such as irrigation or ritual performances. Most people judge time by the sun's position rather than artificial measurements. Morning, midday, and evening were sufficient distinctions for organizing daily work and meals. Precise timekeeping was necessary only for specialized purposes in most communities then. Leather workers prepared animal hides for use in sandals, bags, and other items. The hides were cleaned and treated with substances to preserve them properly. Cutting and sewing were done using bone needles and plant fiber threads. The work required skill developed over years of practice and observation of others. Leather goods were valued for their durability compared to plant fiber alternatives available. Metalworkers shaped copper and bronze into tools, weapons, and decorative objects for uses. The metal was heated in furnaces fueled by charcoal until it became soft. Hammering and casting techniques produced items of different forms and purposes for customers. Metal items were expensive and owned primarily by those of higher status. Most everyday tools remained made of stone, wood, or bone materials instead. Oil was pressed from seeds and used for cooking, lighting, and skin regularly. The seeds were crushed using heavy stones that pressed out the valuable liquid. The oil was collected in jars and stored for gradual use over time. Small oil lamps provided light inside homes during evening hours before sleep. The oil was precious and used carefully to avoid waste in households. Brewing of beer occurred in many households as a regular part of preparation. Barley was partially baked, crumbled, and mixed with water to begin fermentation naturally. The mixture was strained after several days to produce a thick, nutritious beverage. Beer was consumed by adults and children as it was safer than water. The brewing process was familiar to most women and passed between generations. Beekeeping provided honey used for sweetening foods and for medicinal purposes occasionally when needed. Hives were made from clay cylinders placed in locations near flowering plants. Honey was harvested carefully to avoid destroying the hive or angering bees excessively. The sweetness of honey was rare and valued in a diet otherwise lacking. Bees were respected for their productivity and the valuable substance they produced. Hunting supplemented the diet in some areas where wild animals remained accessible to communities. Hunters used spears, bows, and traps to catch birds, small mammals, and game. The hunting required knowledge of animal behavior and patience to be successful. Meat from hunting was shared among those who participated and their families. Hunting was less important than farming for most communities but still contributed. Gardens near homes grew vegetables, herbs, and small fruit trees for household consumption. The gardens received careful attention, including regular watering and removal of pests. Produce from gardens supplemented grain-based meals with additional flavors and nutrition. Women and children typically maintained these small plots as part of daily responsibilities. Gardens provided fresh food without the delay of bringing items from distant fields. Fig trees and date palms grew in some areas, providing fruit during seasons. The fruit was eaten fresh or dried for storage and use throughout year. Trees required years to mature but then produced reliably for many seasons afterward. The fruit was sweet and energy-dense, making it valuable in diet. Trees were planted by families and remained productive for future generations to use. Onions and garlic were grown widely and used to flavor otherwise bland dishes. These plants were hardy and grew in conditions suitable for other crops. They were harvested and braided together for easy storage and access in homes. The strong flavors made monotonous meals more palatable and varied throughout growing season. They were common enough to be available to families of all levels. Lettuce and other leafy vegetables were grown in gardens during cooler months primarily. The plants required more water than grain crops and attention to prevent wilting. They were eaten fresh soon after harvesting as they did not store well. The vegetables provided different textures and tastes in meals otherwise dominated by grain. They were seasonal treats rather than staples available throughout the entire year. Milk from goats and cows was consumed fresh or processed into simple cheeses. The animals were milked in early morning before the heat of day. Fresh milk spoiled quickly and was consumed by families soon after milking occurred. Cheese production preserved milk for longer periods and created a different food product. Not all families owned milk-producing animals but shared access through networks. Eggs from domestic fowl added protein to the diet of families who kept birds. The birds foraged freely during the day and returned to roost at night. Eggs were collected each morning from nests in or near homes and cooked. The eggs were valuable and sometimes used in trade with others for items. Keeping birds required little effort compared to the food value they provided. Grinding grain was labor-intensive and performed by women using stone tools daily. The upper stone was moved back and forth across grain placed on lower. The motion was repeated thousands of times to produce enough flour for bread. The work caused strain on backs and knees from the posture required. Younger girls learned by helping and gradually taking on more of the work. Sifting separated fine flour from coarser particles after grinding was completed each time. Woven sieves allowed fine flour to pass through while retaining larger pieces. The finest flour was used for preferred bread while coarser portions went elsewhere. The process ensured that grain was utilized fully without waste of any portion. Sifting required less physical effort than grinding but still took considerable time. Dough preparation mixed flour with water and sometimes salt or other simple ingredients. The mixture was kneaded by hand until it achieved the right consistency. Experience taught the proper feel of dough ready to be formed into loaves. Too much or too little water resulted in bread that was less desirable. The skill developed over years of daily practice under guidance of experienced women. Fuel for cooking fires came from dried plant materials, animal waste, and wood. Fuel was collected regularly by children and women as part of daily tasks. The fuel was stored in dry locations near cooking areas for access. Fires were managed carefully to conserve fuel while providing necessary heat for cooking. Fuel collection added to the work required to maintain a functioning household. Smoke from cooking fires drifted through villages, creating a familiar smell associated with mealtimes. The smoke also deterred some insects from entering homes, though ventilation was limited. I sometimes became irritated from smoke exposure during cooking and indoor fire use. The discomfort was accepted as normal and unavoidable part of preparing food. Designs of homes attempted to direct smoke upward and outward when possible. Maintenance of tools required periodic sharpening, cleaning, or replacement of broken parts regularly. Stone blades were resharpened by striking off small flakes to create new edges. Wooden handles were replaced when they cracked or broke from use and stress. The work was done by those who used the tools or specialists. Proper maintenance extended the useful life of tools which were valuable to owners. Baskets of various sizes served countless purposes in daily life across all communities. They were woven from reeds, grasses, or palm fronds using techniques adapted locally. Different weaving patterns created baskets suited for carrying, storing, or sifting various contents. Almost everyone knew basic basket-making skills learned from childhood observation and practice. Baskets wore out and were replaced regularly as part of normal household patterns. Rope was made by twisting plant fibers together into strong cords for use. The fibers were prepared by processing plant stalks until individual strands could separate. Twisting was done by hand rolling fibers against the thigh or using tools. Finished rope was coiled and stored for use in construction, tying, or securing. Rope making was ongoing work as rope wore out and needed replacement frequently. The daily routine continued with predictable rhythms familiar to everyone in communities. Morning tasks transitioned into afternoon work and then evening preparations for rest each day. Seasons brought variations, but the basic pattern of life remained consistent over time. People performed the same tasks their parents and grandparents had performed before. The continuity provided stability and understanding of what each day would bring. Fields were worked according to the needs of the crops growing there. Some fields had grain while others had vegetables or other plants for use. The farmers knew each field and what it required for successful growth. They walked the same paths between fields that had been walked for generations. The land was familiar and the work was understood through years of practice. River water continued to flow past the communities, providing essential resources for life. The water was used for irrigation, drinking, washing, and transportation of goods and people. The river's presence shaped the rhythms and possibilities of daily life there. Communities developed near the river for access to this essential resource over time. The relationship between people and river was central to survival in the region. Homes were maintained through ongoing small repairs and adjustments as needed throughout year. Cracks in walls were filled with fresh mud mixed to proper consistency. Roofs were checked after storms and repaired if reeds or mud had shifted. Floors were swept and sometimes resurfaced with fresh mud to keep them level. The maintenance was constant but manageable when done regularly over time. Household items were repaired rather than replaced when possible to conserve resources and effort. Broken pottery was mended with resin or simply reused in different ways. Torn cloth was patched or cut down for other purposes like cleaning rags. Worn baskets were rewoven or their intact sections saved for future use in repairs. Very little was discarded as waste when it could serve another purpose. Social relationships were maintained through daily interactions and exchanges of goods and assistance. Neighbors helped each other with tasks that required multiple people to complete. Families shared food when one had excess and another had need temporarily. These reciprocal relationships created networks of mutual support within communities over time. The social fabric was strengthened through countless small acts of cooperation and sharing. Children's education occurred through participation in the work and life of the community. They learned by watching, listening, and gradually taking on more complex tasks themselves. Mistakes were corrected gently and successes were acknowledged with quiet approval from elders. The learning was informal but effective in transmitting necessary skills and knowledge. By adulthood, most people were competent in the tasks required for survival. Young adults formed households and began their own families following established patterns observed. They built or acquired homes near their parents or other relatives for support. They began performing the same tasks their parents had done in similar ways. The cycle continued as children were born and raised in the same environment. Each generation passed knowledge and skills to the next through daily interaction. Older adults continued to contribute according to their abilities as they aged gradually. They performed lighter tasks or provided advice based on their accumulated experience over decades. Their presence in multi-generational households provided stability and continuity for younger members. They were cared for by family when they could no longer work fully. The elderly were valued for their wisdom and their life of contribution. The passage of time was marked by natural cycles more than by counting days. Seasons changed in predictable patterns that everyone recognized and anticipated throughout year. Lunar cycles provided regular markers that helped organize activities requiring coordination across communities. Agricultural cycles of planting and harvest structured the year into distinct periods of activity. These natural rhythms governed life more than artificial measurements of time did. Work continued throughout most of each day except during the hottest midday hours. People rose with the sun and worked while light permitted their activities. Evening brought a gradual slowing of activity as darkness made work more difficult. The natural cycle of light and dark structured each day in fundamental ways. Artificial lighting extended work into evening only slightly and for limited purposes. Meals provided regular breaks in the work routine and opportunities for social interaction. The timing of meals was determined by hunger and work schedules more than by strict timetables. Food preparation itself was labor that fit into the broader pattern of daily tasks. Eating together reinforced family bonds and provided time for sharing information and planning. The social aspect of meals was as important as the nutrition they provided. Physical labor dominated most people's lives and shaped their bodies and daily experiences. Muscles developed from repeated motions like grinding grain, digging soil, or carrying loads. Calluses formed on hands and feet from constant contact with tools and rough surfaces. Bodies were lean from limited food and high activity levels maintained throughout life. Physical capability determined much of what was possible for individuals and families to achieve. Health was maintained through adequate food, rest, and avoidance of injury when possible. Illness was treated with available remedies, but recovery was not always assured by efforts. Injuries from work or accidents could have lasting effects on ability to contribute. People worked despite minor ailments, as stopping work meant reduced food availability later. The relationship between work and survival was direct and understood by everyone. Food security depended on successful harvests and proper storage of surplus for lean periods. Years with good harvests allowed communities to build reserves for harder times ahead. Poor harvests meant rationing of food and increased reliance on supplementary sources like fish. No single year determined survival, but patterns over multiple years created security or hardship. Planning and careful management were essential for maintaining food supplies throughout the year. Clothing production required significant time and effort, from processing fibers through final garments. The process included growing or gathering materials, processing them into fibers, spinning thread, and weaving. Additional time was spent cutting and assembling garments for family members to wear. Clothing wore out from use and sun exposure, requiring regular replacement of items. Each household devoted substantial labor to maintaining adequate clothing for all members throughout seasons. Shelter maintenance required ongoing attention to prevent deterioration of mud, brick, and wood structures. Rain could erode mud walls if not properly maintained with fresh applications. Wood deteriorated from insects and weather, requiring periodic replacement of damaged pieces. Roofs needed regular attention as reeds decayed and mud layers eroded away. The work of maintaining shelter was never fully completed, but only kept manageable. Water management was critical for both household needs and agricultural production in the region. The channels that brought water to fields required regular clearing of accumulated silt. Household water storage needed cleaning to prevent contamination and maintain quality for use. Access to clean water determined health outcomes and agricultural success for communities near river. Water was too precious to waste and too essential to neglect in any way. Fire management was essential skill requiring constant attention to prevent accidents and conserve fuel. Fires were started using friction methods or transferred from existing fires nearby when possible. The fire was fed carefully to maintain necessary heat without consuming excessive fuel supplies. At night, fires were banked to preserve coals for easier relighting in morning hours. Uncontrolled fire was dangerous to structures and stored food supplies in homes. Animal husbandry required daily attention to feeding, watering, and monitoring health of livestock. Animals that became ill or injured needed treatment or removal from herds quickly. Breeding was managed to maintain and improve quality of animals over time through generations. Young animals required additional care until they could feed and protect themselves adequately. The investment in animals paid returns in milk, meat, labor, and trade value. Grain processing consumed enormous amounts of women's labor throughout every year without pause. The grinding required for daily bread took hours each day to produce sufficient flour. The repetitive motion caused physical wear on bodies performing this essential task daily. Various methods were tried to make grinding more efficient, but technology remained simple. The labor could not be avoided as bread was the primary food source. Bread baking required skill to judge proper dough consistency and baking time for results. Ovens had to be heated to correct temperature using experience as the guide. Bread could burn or remain undercooked if attention wandered during the process itself. The timing of baking coordinated with other tasks that needed completion during the day. Fresh bread was preferred, but stale bread was consumed rather than wasted from household supplies. Beer brewing provided a way to preserve grain and create a nutritious beverage simultaneously. The process was understood and practiced widely among women in most households regularly. Beer was consumed with meals and throughout the day by all family members. The beverage provided calories and some nutrients not available from bread alone in diet. Brewing was integrated into weekly routines along with other food preparation tasks needed. Honey collection was seasonal work that required careful timing and proper techniques for success. The beekeeper watched for signs that honey was ready for harvest from established hives. Smoke was used to calm bees while honey was carefully removed from hives. Some honey was always left to ensure bees could survive and continue production. The sweet substance was valued highly and used sparingly in special preparations only. Fish provided valuable protein, especially during seasons when other foods were less available. Fishermen developed knowledge of where and when fish were most likely to appear. Different techniques were used depending on water conditions and species being sought from river. Fresh fish was consumed quickly while excess catch was preserved through drying or salting. Fishing complemented agricultural production in providing diverse food sources for communities over year. Pottery production created essential containers for storage, cooking, and transport of various materials. The craft required knowledge of clay sources, preparation methods, and firing techniques learned over years. Different vessel shapes served specific purposes understood by potters and their customers alike. Broken pottery was common but could often be repaired or repurposed for continued use. The demand for pottery was constant as vessels wore out and broke regularly. Weaving transformed plant fibers into cloth used for clothing and household textiles throughout year. The process was time-consuming but necessary to provide adequate cloth for families. Different weaving patterns created fabrics suited to different purposes and climate conditions experienced. Cloth was valuable and cared for carefully to extend its useful life as long as possible. Worn cloth was cut into strips for various secondary uses before being discarded finally. Tool maintenance ensured that implements remained functional for the work they were intended to perform. Sharp edges were maintained through regular resharpening using available techniques and materials at hand. Handles were checked for cracks and replaced before they broke during use and caused injury. Tools were stored properly to protect them from weather and damage when not in use. The value of tools made their care a priority for anyone who depended on them. Basket making was a skill possessed by nearly everyone to some degree of competence. Simple baskets could be made by most adults while complex forms required specialized skill. The materials were readily available and could be gathered as needed from nearby locations. Baskets filled many purposes and wore out quickly, requiring constant replacement in households. The ability to make baskets was taught to children as essential practical knowledge. Cordage creation provided rope and twine necessary for countless purposes in daily life there. The twisting of fibers strengthened them and created flexible, strong material for many uses. Different thicknesses were created depending on the intended use of the finished cordage product. Rope was subject to wear and eventually failed, requiring regular production of replacements. The skill was common and practiced regularly by many people in communities. The sun moved across the sky each day in patterns that had been observed for countless generations. The changing angle of sunlight marked the progression of hours from morning through afternoon. Shadows lengthened as the day advanced toward evening and the approaching night. The predictable movement of the sun provided structure to the day's activities and tasks. People worked in rhythm with the sun's position rather than by artificial timekeeping methods. Midday brought the strongest heat and the brightest light to the villages and fields. Work slowed during this period as the heat made physical labor more difficult. People sought shade and rest during the hottest hours of the afternoon period. Water was consumed more frequently during midday to replace what was lost through perspiration. The pause in activity during midday was understood as necessary for health and safety. Afternoon work resumed as the heat began to diminish with the sun's descent. The cooler air made physical labor more tolerable for those working in fields. Tasks that had been set aside during midday were taken up again and continued. The afternoon period was productive as people worked steadily toward completing the day's goals. The approaching evening provided motivation to finish necessary work before darkness arrived. Field work in the afternoon involved checking irrigation channels and adjusting water flow as needed. Plants were inspected for signs of pests or disease that required attention or treatment. Weeds that had been missed in earlier work were removed by hand. The condition of crops was assessed and noted for future reference and planning. Each field received attention according to its specific needs and the crops growing there. Animal care continued throughout the afternoon as herds returned from grazing areas to enclosures. The animals were counted to ensure none had been lost during the day. Water troughs were filled and feed was provided for animals in their enclosures. Young animals were checked for signs of illness or injury that needed treatment. The daily routine of animal care was performed consistently to maintain herd health. Craft work continued in workshops and open areas as the afternoon hours passed. Potters shaped additional vessels and set them aside to dry before firing later. Weavers worked at their looms, making steady progress on cloth being produced. Basket makers gathered and prepared materials for the next day's work ahead. The afternoon was productive time for craftsmen working on their various projects consistently. Women continued food preparation work that had begun earlier in the day throughout afternoon. Ingredients were prepared for the evening meal that would be consumed after sunset. Dough was set aside to rise before being shaped and baked later. Vegetables were cleaned and cut ready for cooking when the time came for meal preparation. The work of preparing food occupied significant portions of each day for most women. Children returned from their play and began helping with afternoon tasks as directed. They carried water, gathered fuel, or performed other simple tasks assigned to them. Older children took on more responsibility and worked alongside adults, learning through practice. The participation of children in household work was expected and considered normal training. Their contributions, though modest, were valued as part of the household's collective effort. Elders rested in shaded areas and sometimes worked on light tasks during afternoon hours. They repaired nets, sorted seeds, or prepared materials others would use in their work. Their pace was slower, but their knowledge guided the work being done around them. Younger people sought advice from elders on techniques or solutions to problems encountered. The exchange of knowledge across generations occurred naturally through these daily interactions continuously. The marketplace in larger towns remained active through the afternoon as people completed exchanges. Those who had traveled from distant villages conducted their business before beginning the return journey. Final negotiations were completed and goods changed hands according to agreed-upon terms. The market would empty gradually as the afternoon advanced toward evening and closing time. Merchants packed remaining goods and prepared to return to their homes nearby. Boats continued moving on the river throughout the afternoon, carrying goods between communities along the water. The crews worked steadily, loading and unloading cargo at various stopping points along the route. The river traffic was constant as trade moved materials to where they were needed most. Boat crews called to each other as they passed, sharing brief news or greetings. The river served as a highway connecting all communities along its length together. Temple activities continued through the afternoon as priests performed required rituals and duties scheduled. Offerings were made at prescribed times according to religious calendar and tradition observed. Records were kept of temple business, inventories, and transactions completed during the day. The temple compound remained a center of activity, distinct from but connected to village life. The priests worked within their specialized roles, serving religious and administrative functions for the community. Scribes continued their work of recording information on materials prepared for writing purposes. They copied texts, recorded transactions, or drafted documents as directed by those employing them. The work required concentration and precision to ensure accuracy of the records being created. Scribes sat in positions that allowed good light to fall on their work surfaces. Their training and skill made them valuable to those who required documentation services regularly. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across fields and through villages as it descended. The quality of light changed, becoming softer and less harsh than midday brightness. Colors appeared different in the angled light of late afternoon than at other times. The changing light signaled the approaching transition from day to evening and coming night. People became aware that the day's work needed completion before darkness arrived soon. Final field work of the day involved securing tools and preparing to return to homes. Tools were cleaned of dirt and stored in designated locations for the next day. Irrigation channels were checked one last time to ensure water would flow properly overnight. The fields were surveyed quickly to note any issues that would require attention tomorrow. Workers gathered their belongings and began walking back toward the village in small groups. Fishing crews returned to shore with their catches from the afternoon's work on river. The fish were unloaded and quickly distributed or prepared for preservation by drying. Nets were checked for damage and repairs were made or scheduled for next day. Boats were secured at their mooring locations along the riverbank for the night. The fishermen cleaned their equipment and prepared to return to their homes nearby. Herds were moved into enclosures as the sun approached the horizon in the west. Gates were closed and secured to prevent animals from wandering during the night. Final counts were made to ensure all animals were accounted for and safely enclosed. Feed and water were checked to ensure animals had adequate supplies for the night. The work of securing animals was completed as part of the evening routine daily. Women began the final cooking preparations for the evening meal as the day ended. Fires were built up to provide heat for cooking the prepared ingredients gathered. Pots were placed over fires and their contents were monitored as they cooked slowly. Bread was removed from ovens and set aside to cool before being served. The smell of cooking food spread through the village, signaling that mealtime approached soon. Children were called to come and prepare for the evening meal with their families. They washed their hands and faces using water provided for this purpose before eating. Younger children were helped by older siblings or parents to ensure they were ready. The children gathered near where the meal would be served, waiting for food. Their day of play and work was ending as the evening routine began predictably. Men returned from fields and washed away the dirt and dust accumulated during work. Water was used sparingly but adequately to clean hands, faces, and feet before meals. Clean garments were put on if available, or dirty ones were brushed of loose dirt. The transition from work to rest was marked by these simple cleaning rituals performed. Men gathered with their families as the evening meal was prepared nearby for serving. Elders took their customary places for the evening meal with family members around them. They were served first as a sign of respect for their age and status. The food was passed from the elders to younger members in established order. Conversations began quietly as people settled into the familiar routine of the evening meal. The gathering together of family marked the end of the workday clearly. The evening meal was eaten slowly as there was no rush to finish. The food was simple but adequate to satisfy hunger after the day's work. Portions were distributed fairly according to the needs of each family member present. Quiet conversations continued throughout the meal on topics related to the day's events. The meal provided both nutrition and social connection at the end of each day. Cleanup after the meal was completed efficiently by those designated for this task. Dishes were washed using water heated over the fire or used cold if fuel was scarce. Food scraps were set aside for animals or disposed of appropriately away from the home. Cooking implements were cleaned and stored in their usual locations, ready for tomorrow's use. The work of cleanup transitioned the household toward preparing for sleep and rest. Fires were reduced to coals that would smolder through the night, providing some warmth. The bright flames were allowed to die down as there was no further need for cooking heat. A small amount of light remained from the glowing coals in the darkness. The fire would be rebuilt in the morning using these preserved coals as starting material. Fire management was a constant responsibility from morning lighting to evening banking of coals. Stories might be told briefly as families sat together before preparing for sleep. The stories were familiar ones heard many times before by all those listening. The telling reinforced shared knowledge and cultural values through repeated exposure to the narratives. Children listened quietly even though they knew the stories well from previous tellings. The storytelling was brief as everyone was tired from the day's work and ready for rest. Sleeping arrangements were made by unrolling mats and positioning them in usual locations inside homes. Each person had an established place where they slept each night without variation. Light coverings were gathered and placed nearby for use if needed during the night. Children settled near parents or siblings in arrangements that provided comfort and security. The household prepared for sleep as darkness deepened outside the home completely now. The village became quiet as families settled into their homes for the night. The sounds of daytime activity faded away, leaving only occasional noises from animals outside. Most people lay on their sleeping mats resting after the long day of work. The darkness was complete except for faint glows from banked fires in some homes. Sleep came naturally to bodies tired from physical labor performed throughout the day. Night sounds replaced the familiar daytime noises in the village and surrounding areas. Insects chirped in steady rhythms that continued through the hours of darkness without pause. Distant animals occasionally called or moved, creating brief sounds that carried through the still air. The river continued flowing past, making soft sounds as water moved over rocks. These night sounds were familiar and did not disturb the sleep of most people. The air cooled gradually as the night progressed through its darkest hours toward dawn. Light coverings were pulled closer by those who felt the change in temperature during sleep. Bodies adjusted naturally to the cooler air without fully waking from rest needed. The night temperature was comfortable in most seasons, requiring little adjustment to sleeping arrangements. The cooling air was welcome after the heat of the day in warmer months. Stars moved slowly across the sky in patterns that had been observed for generations. The positions of stars changed through the night as the earth turned beneath them. Some people woke briefly and noticed the star positions before returning to sleep again. The stars provided markers of time's passage for those who understood their movements well. The night sky remained mostly unchanged from night to night in its basic appearance. The moon rose or was absent depending on its cycle through the month. When present, the moon provided some light that filtered through doorways and openings in homes. The moonlight was sufficient to see shapes and movement if someone woke during night. On moonless nights, the darkness was more complete and movement more difficult without artificial light. The moon's cycle was familiar and its absence or presence was expected accordingly. Some people woke during the night for various reasons before returning to sleep. A child might wake needing reassurance from a parent sleeping nearby on the mats. An adult might rise to check on animals or adjust the fire if needed. These wakings were brief interruptions in the otherwise unbroken sleep of the night. Most people returned to sleep quickly after these brief periods of waking and activity. Dreams occurred during sleep, though they were not often remembered upon waking in morning. The content of dreams varied but was considered unimportant by most people in communities. Sleep was valued for the rest it provided rather than for dreams that might occur. Dreams faded quickly from memory once waking occurred in the morning light ahead. The purpose of night was rest and recovery of strength for the coming day. The deepest sleep occurred during the middle hours of the night for most people. Breathing was slow and regular as bodies rested completely from the day's exertions. Movement was minimal during these hours of deep sleep and restoration of energy. The night provided essential rest that could not be obtained during waking hours of work. Bodies repaired themselves and restored energy depleted by the previous day's labor during sleep. Very young children slept through most of the night without waking in most cases. Their small bodies required more sleep than adults to support their growth and development. Parents positioned themselves near young children to respond if they woke needing attention during darkness. The sleep of children was deeper and longer than that of adults typically. Children woke refreshed and ready for another day of play and learning ahead. Elderly people sometimes slept less soundly than younger adults during the night hours. They might wake more frequently or sleep for shorter total periods than others nearby. Age brought changes in sleep patterns that were accepted as natural and expected by all. Elders rested during the day if nighttime sleep was insufficient for their needs. The community understood that sleep patterns changed with age over the course of a lifetime. Animals in their enclosures also rested during the night hours, though not as deeply. Cattle and goats lay down in their shelters chewing cud or simply resting quietly. The animals stirred occasionally but generally remained calm and quiet through the night hours. Their sounds were familiar to those sleeping nearby and did not cause concern or disturbance. The animals' rest prepared them for another day of grazing or work ahead tomorrow. Dogs kept by some families remained alert even during nighttime hours of rest. They would bark if unfamiliar sounds or movements occurred near the village during darkness. Their warnings alerted people to potential dangers from animals or other threats approaching nearby. The dogs were valued for this protective function they provided to households and community. Their presence allowed people to sleep more peacefully, knowing they would be alerted if needed. The hours passed slowly as the night progressed toward the time when dawn would arrive. The village remained quiet with only occasional sounds breaking the stillness of darkness completely. Most people slept deeply unaware of time's passage through the night hours stretching ahead. The rest accumulated gradually preparing bodies and minds for another day of similar activities. The night served its essential purpose of providing recovery time needed by all living things. Pre-dawn hours brought the coolest temperatures of the entire day and night cycle combined. Additional coverings were used by those who felt the chill during these hours before sunrise. Bodies naturally conserved warmth by curling slightly and remaining still during sleep in cold periods. The cool air was refreshing and made sleep deep and restorative for most people. The temperature would rise again once the sun appeared over the horizon in the east. The first hints of dawn appeared as a faint lightening of the eastern sky. The change was gradual and almost imperceptible at first to those still sleeping inside homes. The stars began to fade as the sky slowly brightened with the approaching sunrise ahead. Birds began calling softly as they sensed the coming of day and new light. The transition from night to day had begun, though most people still slept peacefully. Some people began to wake as the pre-dawn light increased enough to penetrate their homes. They stirred on their mats but did not yet rise to begin the day's work. The awakening was gradual, allowing the transition from sleep to waking to occur naturally and gently. Bodies became aware of the need to rise but remained at rest briefly longer. The day would begin soon, but not quite yet in these quiet moments before full dawn. Morning routines began as people rose from their sleeping mats in their homes. The mats were rolled and stored in their usual places along the walls. Light garments were adjusted or changed for the work that would be done today. Children woke more slowly and were helped by parents to prepare for the day. The household began moving toward the activities that would occupy the daylight hours ahead. Fires were rekindled from the coals that had been preserved through the night carefully. Small sticks and dried grasses were added to coax flames from the glowing embers. Water was placed over the fire to heat for washing and for morning preparations. The fire provided warmth in the cool morning air before the sun rose higher. Fire tending was the first task completed each morning in most households regularly. Morning washing was done using small amounts of water heated over the fire briefly. Faces and hands were cleaned to remove the dust of sleep and prepare for day. The washing was quick and efficient, using minimal water for the purpose intended. Children were helped to wash by parents or older siblings as part of the routine. The washing provided a transition between sleep and the beginning of daily work ahead. Bread from the previous day was eaten for the morning meal in most households. The bread was consumed with water or sometimes with a small portion of beer. The meal was simple and eaten quickly as work needed to begin soon. Children received smaller portions appropriate to their size and needs for the day. The morning meal provided energy for the work that would begin shortly after eating. Animals were released from their enclosures to begin grazing in designated areas near the village. Children or young adults guided the animals to areas where grass was available for feeding. The animals moved slowly in the cool morning air toward their grazing locations familiar. Water was available in some grazing areas or would be provided later in the day. The animals would graze throughout the morning before returning in the afternoon hours. Field work began as soon as there was sufficient light to see the crops. Farmers walked to their fields carrying the tools needed for the day's tasks ahead. The morning air was still cool, making physical labor more comfortable than later hours. Work proceeded steadily as farmers attended to the needs of crops in their care. The morning was considered the best time for work requiring sustained physical effort and concentration. Water channels were inspected and cleared of any debris that had accumulated overnight or recently. The flow of water was adjusted to ensure all parts of fields received adequate moisture. Small repairs were made to channel walls that had eroded or been damaged somehow. The work of water management was constant and required attention nearly every day. Proper water flow was essential for crop health and eventual harvest success later. Weeds were removed from fields where they competed with desired plants for nutrients and water. The work was done by hand, requiring workers to move through fields systematically and carefully. Young weeds were easier to remove but required close observation to identify them correctly. The removed weeds were gathered and used as animal feed or composted for fertilizer. Weeding was ongoing work throughout the growing season without end until harvest time. Women began grinding grain soon after the morning meal was completed in households. The grinding stones were prepared and grain was measured for the day's bread production. The work was physically demanding and would continue for several hours until enough flour. The sound of grinding echoed through the village as multiple women worked simultaneously nearby. The work was familiar and performed in steady rhythms developed through years of practice. Children not yet old enough for field work helped with household tasks under supervision. They carried water from the river in small vessels they could manage safely. They gathered fuel for fires or helped with sorting seeds and grains for storage. Their work was scaled to their capabilities and increased as they grew stronger. The participation in household work taught skills that would be needed throughout their lives. Craftsmen began their work in workshops once morning light was sufficient for detailed tasks. Potters prepared clay and began shaping vessels on their wheels in steady motions. Weavers sat at looms and resumed work on cloth that had been started previously. The work proceeded at a measured pace that could be sustained throughout the day. Breaks were taken as needed, but the work continued steadily toward daily production goals. Market activity began in larger towns as merchants arrived and set up their displays. Goods were arranged on mats or tables for examination by potential buyers who would arrive. Early arrivals sometimes completed quick transactions before the main crowds of the day appeared. The market would become busier as the morning progressed toward the midday period ahead. Trade was an important part of economic life for communities in the region. Temple activities began with morning rituals performed by priests according to established schedules and traditions. Offerings were made and prayers were recited in the prescribed manner learned through training. The rituals connected the community with divine forces believed to influence daily life importantly. Priests moved through their duties with practiced efficiency developed over years of service. The temple rhythm was separate from but parallel to the village work patterns nearby. River traffic increased as boats departed for destinations along the water in both directions. Cargo was loaded onto boats by crews working efficiently to complete the tasks quickly. Passengers boarded boats for travel to other communities for various purposes of trade or visits. The river was busy with movement as transportation and trade networks functioned throughout the day. The river remained the primary route for movement of goods and people across distances. The sun rose higher, bringing increasing warmth to the air and the land below. Workers adjusted their pace and sought shade more frequently as heat began to build. Water consumption increased as bodies lost moisture through perspiration during the physical labor performed. The transition from cool morning to warm midday occurred gradually but was felt by everyone. The rhythm of work adjusted naturally to accommodate the changing temperature throughout the morning hours. Grain grinding continued in households with women working in shifts or taking brief rests. The grinding was exhausting work but necessary to produce flour for daily bread needs. Younger women sometimes relieved older women who needed rest from the physical demands of grinding. The flour accumulated gradually in containers placed near the grinding stones for collection later. The work would continue until sufficient flour was produced for the day's baking requirements. Sifting of ground flour separated the finest particles for bread from coarser materials remaining. The The sifting was done using woven screens that allowed fine flour to pass through. The work required less physical effort than grinding but still demanded time and attention. The finest flour was reserved for the best bread while coarser material went to other uses. The sifting ensured that all parts of the grain were utilized without waste. Dough preparation began once sufficient flour had been ground and sifted for the day. Water was added to flour in proportions determined by experience and the feel of dough. Kneading mixed the ingredients thoroughly and developed the texture needed for good bread later. The kneading required strength and was often done by younger women with strong arms. The prepared dough was set aside to rise before being shaped into loaves. Ovens were prepared and heated to the temperature needed for baking bread properly later. Fuel was added carefully to achieve the right heat without wasting precious materials unnecessarily. The oven temperature was judged by experience rather than by any measuring device available. Proper oven temperature was critical for producing good bread that was neither burned nor undercooked. The heating of ovens was timed to coordinate with dough rising and shaping activities. Field inspections continued as farmers moved through crops checking for any problems needing attention. Pests were removed by hand or deterred using methods learned through experience and tradition. Plants showing signs of disease were removed to prevent spread to healthy crops nearby. The constant vigilance helped ensure that problems were addressed before they became serious threats. Each field required individual attention based on the specific crops and their current conditions. Midday approached, bringing the strongest heat and brightest light of the entire day to the region. Work slowed or paused entirely during the hottest hours to avoid exhaustion and heat-related illness. People moved to shaded areas or returned to homes to rest during this period. Food and water were consumed during this break from labor in the fields and workshops. The midday rest was necessary for health and allowed people to continue work later. Children played in shaded areas during the midday rest period while adults rested nearby. Their games were quieter during the heat, requiring less physical exertion than morning play. Adults watched from resting positions, ensuring children remained safe during their play activities together. The sounds of children were part of the familiar background of village life daily. The midday period provided a natural break in the day's rhythm for everyone present. Elders sat in shaded gathering places during midday discussing matters of interest to the community. Their conversations covered past experiences, current concerns, and observations about village life in general. Younger people sometimes listened to gain knowledge from the accumulated wisdom of older generations. The elders' perspective was valued and their opinions were considered in community decisions when needed. The midday gathering of elders was a regular feature of village life and social structure. The midday rest continued as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. The heat made movement uncomfortable and work inefficient during these hours of strongest sunlight. Most people remained in shaded areas waiting for the temperature to decrease somewhat before resuming. Water was sipped slowly to maintain hydration without consuming the limited supply too quickly. The rest period was accepted as necessary rather than optional in the daily schedule. Afternoon work would resume when the sun had descended enough to reduce the heat. The timing was judged by the position of the sun and the feel of air. There was no precise moment when work resumed, but rather a gradual return to activity. People began moving from shaded rest areas back toward their work locations in fields. The transition from rest to work occurred naturally as the day progressed toward evening. Bread baking occurred during the afternoon once ovens had reached proper temperature for the task. Shaped loaves were placed carefully into ovens heated by fires built earlier in the day. The baking required attention to prevent burning while ensuring thorough cooking of the dough. The smell of baking bread spread through the village, signaling this daily activity to all. Fresh bread would be available for the evening meal and the following day's consumption. Field work resumed with tasks that had been set aside during the midday heat. Irrigation water was checked and adjusted to compensate for evaporation during the hot hours. Workers moved more slowly in the afternoon heat but continued their necessary tasks steadily. The crops required attention regardless of the temperature or comfort of the workers tending them. The work continued as it had to if harvests were to be successful later. Animal herds began returning from grazing areas as afternoon progressed toward evening hours ahead. Children or herders guided the animals back toward the village and their enclosures there. The animals moved willingly, knowing that water and shelter awaited them at journey's end. Dust rose from the paths as hooves disturbed the dry earth during the return. The movement of animals back to the village was a daily pattern repeated without variation. Craft production continued in workshops as afternoon light remained adequate for detailed work needed. Potters removed dried pieces from earlier work and prepared them for firing in kilns. Weavers made steady progress on cloth production, working at sustainable pace throughout the afternoon. The afternoon was productive time, though perhaps less so than the cooler morning hours. The craftsmen worked toward daily production goals that maintained their income and household needs. Women completed bread baking and began preparations for the evening meal that would come later. Vegetables were prepared and ingredients were assembled for the cooking that would occur at sunset. The work of food preparation occupied substantial portions of women's time throughout each day predictably. The meals were similar from day to day, reducing the complexity of planning and preparation. The familiar routines made the work manageable despite the time required to complete it. Children helped with afternoon tasks appropriate to their age and developing capabilities over time. Older children took on more responsibility while younger ones performed simpler tasks under supervision. The participation of children in household work was normal and expected by all members. The work taught skills and also contributed meaningfully to the household's functioning and survival. Children learned through doing rather than through formal instruction, in most cases entirely. Market activity decreased as afternoon progressed and merchants prepared to return to their homes. Final transactions were completed and remaining goods were packed for transport back to storage. The marketplace would empty gradually as people departed for their homes in the village. The market operated on regular schedules that were understood by all who participated. The rhythm of market activity was part of the larger pattern of community life. River traffic continued, with boats making final trips before evening darkness made navigation more difficult. Crews worked to complete deliveries and return to home ports before nightfall when possible. The river remained busy until light began to fade from the western sky completely. Navigation in darkness was possible but more challenging and therefore avoided when circumstances permitted. The river rhythm followed the sun's cycle through the day like other activities did. Temple activities continued with afternoon rituals and administrative work by priests throughout the day. Records were updated and preparations were made for the next day's ceremonies and functions. The temple operated on schedules separate from but coordinated with agricultural and community rhythms around it. The priests maintained their specialized roles, serving religious and administrative needs of the broader community. The temple presence was constant in the background of daily village life, always there. Fishing crews returned to shore with afternoon catches to be processed before darkness fell. The fish were cleaned and distributed to families or prepared for preservation through drying. Nets were inspected and repaired as needed to maintain them in good working condition. The fishing equipment was stored properly to protect it from damage and deterioration overnight. Fishing provided important supplemental food that varied the diet beyond grain-based staples consumed daily. Tools used in fields during the day were cleaned and stored in designated locations. The cleaning removed dirt and debris that could cause damage if left on the tools. Proper storage protected tools from weather and theft during the night hours when unattended. The care of tools was important as they were valuable and not easily replaced. Each household maintained its tools through regular cleaning and periodic sharpening or repair as needed. Water jars were refilled for evening and nighttime needs in households throughout the village. The water was carried from the river in the same daily trips that had occurred. Fresh water was preferred for drinking and cooking, while older water was used for washing. The water carrying continued until sufficient supply was available for anticipated needs until morning. The work of water carrying was constant and necessary every single day without exception. Firewood and fuel were gathered for evening cooking fires and nighttime warmth if needed. Children collected small sticks and dried plant materials from areas near the village designated. The fuel was stored near cooking areas for convenient access when needed for fires. Adequate fuel was essential for cooking the evening meal and maintaining some warmth overnight. The gathering of fuel was ongoing work that required daily attention to maintain adequate supplies. Cooking fires were built as the sun approached the horizon and evening approached the village. Wood and dried materials were arranged and lit using coals from fires maintained during day. The fires were built up to provide heat for cooking the prepared ingredients for meal. Pots were placed over fires and their contents were monitored as cooking progressed slowly. The evening meal preparation followed the same pattern each day with only minor variations. Animals were secured in their enclosures as evening approached and darkness would soon follow. Gates were checked and fastened to prevent animals from wandering during the night ahead. Feed and water were provided to ensure animals were comfortable through the night hours. The animals settled into their enclosures with familiar sounds of movement and occasional calls. The securing of animals completed the transition from day work to evening rest routines. Men returned from fields as daylight faded and work became difficult to continue safely. They walked along familiar paths back to the village carrying tools used during the day. The return was gradual as different workers finished their tasks at slightly different times. Dust from the paths hung in the still evening air as groups walked homeward. The day's field work was complete and would resume again tomorrow morning as usual. Evening washing removed the dirt and dust accumulated during the day's work and activities. Water was used to clean hands, faces, and feet before the evening meal was served. The washing was done outside near cooking areas using water provided for this purpose. Clean garments were put on if available, or dirty ones were brushed to remove loose dirt. The washing marked the transition from work to rest and the evening meal ahead. Families gathered for the evening meal as cooking was completed and food was ready. The gathering occurred in the same locations used for previous meals throughout many days. Elders were served first, followed by other family members in established order of respect. The food was simple but adequate to satisfy hunger after the day's physical labor. The meal provided both nutrition and opportunity for family connection at day's end. Conversations during the evening meal were quiet and focused on simple daily matters observed. Events of the day might be mentioned briefly without elaborate discussion or analysis. Children shared observations from their play or work done during the day just past. The conversations were relaxed and unhurried as there was no pressure to finish quickly. The social aspect of eating together was valued as much as the food consumed. The evening meal concluded as people finished eating the portions provided to them earlier. Dishes and cooking implements were gathered for cleaning before darkness made work more difficult. Water was used to wash items, which were then stored in their usual places. Food scraps were set aside for animals or disposed of away from the home. The cleanup transitioned the household toward evening rest and preparation for sleep ahead. Fires were reduced to glowing coals that would provide minimal warmth through the night. The reduction of fires saved fuel and reduced the risk of uncontrolled burning overnight. Some light remained from the coals, allowing movement inside homes during early darkness hours. The fire would be rebuilt in the morning from these preserved coals to begin another day. Fire management continued through the evening as part of the daily cycle of household maintenance. Evening activities were limited as darkness made most work impossible without adequate lighting sources. Some simple tasks could be done by firelight if necessary, but most work ceased. Families sat together near fires talking quietly or preparing directly for sleep ahead soon. The evening was a time of rest rather than continued labor after the long day. The rhythm of the day moved naturally towards sleep as darkness deepened outside homes. Stories might be shared during evening hours when families gathered before sleeping began for all. The stories were familiar ones told many times before by elders to younger listeners. The narratives reinforced cultural values and shared knowledge across generations through repeated telling over time. Children listened even though they knew the stories well from previous hearings of same tales. The storytelling was brief as fatigue from the day's work made everyone ready for rest. Sleeping mats were unrolled and positioned in locations used every night by each household member. The positioning followed established patterns with children near parents and elders in preferred spots. Light coverings were gathered and placed nearby for use during the night if needed. The preparation for sleep followed the same sequence each night, creating familiar routine for all. The household settled towards sleep as the final activity of the day before rest. The village became progressively quieter as families prepared for sleep in their homes nearby. The sounds of evening activity faded, leaving only the sounds of night emerging instead. Insects began their nighttime chorus as darkness settled over the village and surrounding fields. The transition from day to night was complete as the last activity ceased. The village rested as people slept through the hours of darkness until dawn returned. Night brought cooler temperatures and the absence of light from the sun now set. The darkness was nearly complete except for faint moonlight when the moon was present. Most people slept deeply after the physical exertion of the day's work performed throughout. The night provided essential rest that allowed bodies to recover for another similar day. Sleep was valued and protected as necessary for maintaining health and ability to work. Dogs remained alert during the night, watching for threats to the village and households within. They would bark if unusual sounds or movements occurred near the village during darkness. Their vigilance provided security, allowing people to sleep without constant worry about dangers approaching. The dogs were valued for this protective function they performed throughout each night reliably. Their presence was part of the village's defense against threats that might come in darkness. The hours of night passed slowly while most people slept undisturbed in their homes. The village was still except for occasional animal sounds from enclosures or distant areas. The river continued flowing past, making soft sounds that blended with insect choruses and night. The natural sounds of night were familiar and did not disturb the sleep of villagers. The night served its purpose of providing rest before another day would begin at dawn. Stars appeared in the sky above as darkness became complete over the village below. The patterns of stars were familiar to those who observed them regularly through the seasons. Some stars were brighter than others and served as markers for navigation and timekeeping. The stars moved across the sky through the night as the earth turned beneath. The celestial patterns remained constant night after night, providing reliable markers of time's passage. The moon's phase changed gradually through its monthly cycle from new to full and back. When the moon was full, it provided substantial light during the night hours. The moonlight allowed some movement and activity during darkness if necessary for any reason. On nights when the moon was new, the darkness was more complete and profound. The moon's cycle was understood and expected by all who lived in the village. Sleep patterns varied among the people resting in their homes during the night hours. Young children slept most soundly and for the longest periods without waking during darkness. Adults slept less deeply and might wake briefly during the night before returning to sleep. Elders sometimes had difficulty sleeping through the entire night without interruption or waking periods. The variations in sleep were accepted as natural differences between people of different ages. Some people woke during the night needing to relieve themselves outside the home briefly. They moved quietly to avoid disturbing others who continued sleeping on their mats. The brief time outside allowed them to see the night sky and feel the cool air. They returned quickly to their sleeping places and resumed their rest until morning came. These brief wakings were common and did not prevent adequate rest through the night overall. The coolest part of the night occurred in the hours just before dawn would arrive. Bodies drew coverings closer during this period to maintain warmth while sleeping through the cold. The temperature would begin rising again once the sun appeared over the eastern horizon. The cycle of cooling through the night and warming through the day was predictable and constant. The temperature variations required minor adjustments to sleeping arrangements, but nothing more significant than that. Night creatures were active during the dark hours when people slept in their homes. Small animals moved about foraging for food in areas near the village and fields. Larger predators sometimes approached but were deterred by dogs or fires still glowing faintly. The sounds of night creatures were part of the familiar background of darkness each evening. The presence of night creatures was known but rarely caused problems for the sleeping village. The night continued through its darkest hours as the village rested in complete stillness. The breathing of sleepers was slow and steady, creating barely audible sounds in the darkness. Bodies lay on sleeping mats arranged in the same positions used every night previously. The stillness was broken only by occasional sounds from animals or distant night creatures outside. The hours of deepest night passed slowly while people slept, unaware of time moving forward. Dawn would eventually arrive, bringing light and the beginning of another day of similar activities. The pattern would repeat as it had countless times before in this place along the river. People would rise and begin their work according to familiar routines known to all members. The day would unfold in predictable ways shaped by the season and the work required. The cycles would continue turning as they had for generations before this current time. The daily rhythm of life was shaped by the sun's movement across the sky. Morning brought cool air and the beginning of work in fields and households throughout. Midday brought heat and a necessary pause in physical labor to avoid exhaustion from exertion. Afternoon saw the resumption of work as temperatures decreased toward evening and sunset time. Evening brought the completion of work and preparation for rest during the night ahead. Seasonal rhythms overlaid the daily patterns, creating larger cycles through the year ahead. The flood season brought water that renewed fields and made agriculture possible in this region. Planting season followed as water receded and fields became accessible for working once more. Growing season required constant attention to crops as they developed toward eventual harvest time. Harvest season brought intense work gathering crops before storage for the months ahead until next planting. The annual cycle of seasons repeated year after year with only minor variations observed. The timing of the flood was generally predictable, though the exact dates varied somewhat. The amount of water deposited on fields changed from year to year, affecting crop yields. The community adapted to these variations through experience accumulated over many generations of living here. The relationship with the river and its cycles was central to survival and prosperity. Generational cycles saw the replacement of older people with younger ones over time passing. Children grew to adulthood and formed their own families following patterns they had observed. Adults aged and eventually became elders who contributed wisdom rather than physical labor to community. Elders eventually died and were replaced by the next generation, moving through the same stages. The continuity of community was maintained through this constant cycle of birth, growth, and death. Knowledge passed from generation to generation through observation and participation in daily work activities. Children learned by watching and gradually taking on tasks under the guidance of experienced adults. The learning was informal but effective in transmitting the skills needed for survival here. Each generation learned what the previous generation had learned before them in similar ways. The knowledge accumulated over many generations and was refined through countless repetitions of work. The community maintained itself through the collective labor of all its capable members together. Each person contributed according to their abilities and received support when their abilities diminished with age. The reciprocal relationships between households created networks of mutual aid and support over time. No single household could survive in isolation from the others in the community around them. The social bonds were strengthened through daily interactions and exchanges of goods and assistance offered. Trade connected communities along the river and allowed exchange of goods not produced locally. Boats carried products from one area to another, creating economic connections between distant places. Markets provided locations where individuals could exchange surplus production for needed items they lacked. The trade networks were essential for obtaining materials and goods not available in immediate area. The economic relationships were part of the larger pattern of community life and survival here. Religious practices connected communities with forces beyond their direct control or understanding completely. Offerings and rituals expressed gratitude and sought favor from deities believed to influence outcomes. The practices were performed regularly according to traditions passed down through many generations before. Priests served specialized functions, maintaining temples and performing ceremonies for the community members regularly. The religious life was woven into daily activities rather than separated from ordinary work. The river remained the central feature of life in this region throughout all seasons. Water from the river made agriculture possible in an otherwise dry landscape around it. The river provided transportation, allowing movement of goods and people between distant communities efficiently. Fish from the river supplemented the grain-based diet with protein and variety in meals. Reeds and plants from the river provided materials for countless purposes in daily life. Fields stretched along the river on land made fertile by annual flooding and deposition. The fields were worked by many people cooperating to plant, tend, and harvest crops together. The produce from fields fed the community and provided surplus for trade with others. The fields required constant attention throughout the growing season to ensure successful harvests would result. The agricultural cycle structured the year and determined the rhythm of community life here. Homes provided shelter from sun and occasional rain for families living in the village. The homes were built from materials available locally, including mud, reeds, and wood gathered. Maintenance of homes was ongoing work required to keep them functional and protective over time. The interior spaces were simple, containing only essential items needed for daily living activities. The homes reflected practical needs rather than desires for comfort or display of wealth. Tools enabled the work that sustained the community through agricultural and craft production activities. The tools were simple but effective for the purposes they served in daily work. Maintenance of tools was essential to keep them functional for the work they performed. Proper care extended the useful life of tools, which had value to those who used them. The tools were made from materials available locally or obtained through trade with others. Clothing protected bodies from sun while remaining light enough for the warm climate experienced here. The production of clothing required substantial time, from processing fibers through the final garments made. Clothing wore out from use and sun exposure, requiring regular replacement of items over time. Each household produced the clothing needed for its members through women's labor devoted to this. The clothing was simple and functional rather than decorative in most cases for most people. Food preparation occupied significant portions of women's time throughout every day without exception or variation. Grinding grain into flour was the most labor-intensive part of food preparation performed. Bread baking occurred daily, providing the primary food consumed by all community members regularly. Other foods supplemented bread, but grain remained the foundation of the diet for everyone. The work of food preparation was essential and could not be neglected or postponed safely. Water management was critical for both household needs and agricultural production in this dry region. Channels brought water from the river to fields where crops grew during the season. Household water was carried from the river in jars by women and children daily. The water was too precious to waste and too essential to neglect in any way. Access to clean water determined health outcomes and agricultural success for communities living here. Children represented the future of the community and were raised with care and attention. They learned through participation in daily work alongside adults from whom they learned skills. Play provided opportunities for physical development and social learning among children of similar ages. Children were valued as the next generation who would continue the community into the future. The raising of children was shared among family members and broader community networks together. Elders provided wisdom based on accumulated experience over many decades of living and working. Their knowledge guided decisions about timing of planting, methods of work, and solutions to problems. Their presence in households provided stability and connection to earlier generations who had lived before. The elders were respected and cared for when they could no longer contribute physical labor. The wisdom of elders was valued as essential to the community's functioning and survival. Health was maintained through adequate food, clean water, rest, and avoidance of injury when possible. Illness was treated with remedies made from plants and minerals according to traditional knowledge passed. Recovery from illness was not guaranteed and many people died from diseases that could not be cured. Injuries from work or accidents could have lasting effects on a person's ability to contribute labor. The relationship between health and survival was direct and understood by everyone in the community. Death was part of life and was understood as a transition rather than an ending. Funerary practices prepared the deceased for their journey to the afterlife according to beliefs held. Mourning periods allowed families to grieve while maintaining the work necessary for survival of the living. The memory of the deceased was preserved through offerings and stories told about them. Death removed individuals, but the community continued through the surviving members who remained behind. Festivals marked important points in the agricultural and religious calendar throughout the year ahead. The festivals provided breaks from ordinary labor and opportunities for community gathering and celebration. Special foods were prepared and consumed during festivals that were not available during ordinary times. The festivals reinforced social bonds and provided something to anticipate during routine periods of work. Participation in festivals was both religious duty and social necessity for community members here. The patterns of life continued day after day with only minor variations from the established routines. The sameness provided stability and predictability that allowed the community to function effectively over time. Each day was similar to the previous day and to the day that would follow tomorrow. The work was familiar and the outcomes were generally predictable based on past experience accumulated. The continuity of patterns was valued more than novelty or change in most circumstances here. The work of maintaining the community required effort from all capable members throughout the year. No single person could provide everything needed for survival in this environment alone without help. Families cooperated with each other, sharing labor for tasks requiring multiple people to complete. The cooperation extended beyond immediate family to include neighbors and more distant relatives nearby. The network of mutual support made survival possible where individual effort would have failed. Storage of surplus production allowed communities to survive between harvest periods when no new food. Large containers made of clay held grain protected from moisture and pests during storage. The containers were inspected regularly to ensure contents remained in good condition over time. Proper storage techniques had been developed through experience over many generations of practice here. The stored surplus represented security against poor harvests or unexpected losses of current crops. Irrigation systems brought water from the river to fields located at various distances away. The channels required regular maintenance to keep them clear and functioning properly for water delivery. Workers cooperated to maintain channels that served multiple fields belonging to different families together. The shared irrigation infrastructure required collective effort to build and maintain over time successfully. Water management was too important to be left to individual households acting alone separately. Craft production created items needed by the community but not produced through agriculture directly. Potters made containers essential for storage, cooking, and transport of various materials needed daily. Weavers produced cloth used for clothing and household textiles by all families and community. Basket makers created containers used for countless purposes in daily life and work activities. The craftsmen traded their products for food produced by farmers in mutually beneficial exchanges. Boat building required specialized skills developed over years of practice and observation of experienced builders. The boats were essential for transportation and trade along the river, connecting distant communities together. Different boat designs served different purposes, from fishing to cargo transport to passenger movement efficiently. The boats were maintained carefully to extend their useful life in service to the community. Boat builders occupied an important position in the economic life of river communities here. Fishing provided protein that supplemented the grain-based diet consumed by most people regularly. Different fishing techniques were used depending on the season and the species being sought from river. The knowledge of where and when to fish was passed from experienced fishermen to apprentices. Fresh fish was consumed quickly while excess catch was preserved through drying for later consumption. Fishing was less central than agriculture but still contributed importantly to food security for communities. Hunting supplemented the food supply in areas where game remained accessible to hunters from villages. The hunting required knowledge of animal behavior and skill with weapons developed through practice over time. Meat from hunting was shared among participants and their families according to established customs here. Hunting was less reliable than agriculture or fishing as a food source in most areas. The contribution of hunting to diet varied depending on location and availability of game animals. Gardens near homes produced vegetables and herbs that added variety to grain-dominated meals eaten. The gardens received careful attention from women and children who maintained them as daily responsibility. Fresh vegetables were valued for the different tastes and textures they provided in otherwise monotonous diet. The gardens required water carried from the river and constant attention to protect from pests. Garden production was small-scale but meaningful in improving the quality of meals consumed. Beekeeping provided honey valued for its sweetness in a diet lacking concentrated sugars otherwise available. The bees were kept in cylindrical hives made of clay placed near flowering plants for access. Honey collection required careful timing and technique to avoid destroying hives or angering bees excessively. The honey was used sparingly in special preparations and for medicinal purposes when needed rarely. Bees were respected for their industry and the valuable product they created through their labor. Oil production from seeds provided fuel for lamps and cooking medium for food preparation needs. The seeds were crushed using heavy stones that pressed out the valuable oil they contained. The oil was collected carefully and stored in sealed containers for gradual use over time. Oil lamps provided light during evening hours, allowing some activity after sunset when needed occasionally. The oil was precious and used carefully to avoid waste of this limited resource available. Beer brewing preserved grain in liquid form and created a beverage consumed throughout the day. The brewing process was understood by most women who made beer regularly in their households. Beer provided calories and was often safer to drink than water from uncertain sources nearby. The brewing was integrated into weekly routines along with other food preparation tasks performed regularly. Beer was consumed by all ages as a staple beverage rather than an occasional treat. Metal working created tools and objects from copper and bronze through heating and shaping processes. The metal was expensive and metal items were owned primarily by those of higher status. Most tools used by farmers remained made of stone, wood, or bone rather than metal. Metal workers occupied a specialized position in the community due to their rare skills possessed. The products of metal working were valued but not accessible to all community members equally. Leather working transformed animal hides into durable goods used for various purposes by households. The hides were cleaned and treated with substances that preserved them and made them workable. Leather goods included sandals, bags, and other items valued for durability over time and use. The leather working required skills developed over years of practice and observation of experienced workers. Leather goods were more expensive than plant fiber alternatives but lasted longer with proper care. Scribal work created records needed for temple administration and government functions in larger centers. Scribes trained for many years learning the complex writing system used for record keeping. The training required memorization of hundreds of symbols and their proper usage in texts written. Scribes worked for temples, government officials, or wealthy families keeping accounts and records needed. The position of scribe provided status and security not available to agricultural workers in fields. Administrative functions coordinated the collection of taxes and organization of large-scale projects requiring many workers. Officials recorded contributions and organized labor for building projects and temple maintenance work needed. The administrative system allowed coordination across multiple communities for shared purposes and goals identified. The system required literacy and numerical skills possessed by relatively few people in communities overall. The administrative structure was part of the larger political organization of the region governed. The patterns of daily life continued with rhythms established over countless generations before this time. Morning brought the beginning of work as people rose from sleep and began their tasks. Midday brought heat and rest from the most strenuous labor performed in fields and workshops. Afternoon saw the resumption of work as heat diminished and evening approached gradually ahead. Evening brought the completion of work and preparation for the night's rest in homes. The sun rose each morning over the river bringing light to the fields and villages. The sunrise marked the beginning of another day similar to the day that had preceded it. People woke and began their morning routines in the same patterns followed every day. The predictability of the sunrise and the day's beginning provided structure to life here. The sun's movement across the sky measured the passage of time through each day reliably. Water was carried from the river as it had been carried yesterday and would be tomorrow. The path to the river was worn smooth from the constant passage of feet over time. Women and children balanced jars on their shoulders as they walked to and from water. The water was essential for drinking, cooking, washing, and irrigation of crops in fields nearby. The carrying of water was endless work that could never be completed, only temporarily satisfied. Grain was ground into flour using the same stones that had been used for years. The motion of grinding was repetitive and physically demanding, requiring strength and endurance from women. The sound of grinding echoed through the village as multiple women worked at the task. The flour produced would become bread that would sustain the community another day forward. The grinding would be repeated tomorrow and the day after in endless succession, continuing. Bread was baked in ovens heated to temperatures judged by experience accumulated over many years. The bread provided the foundation of the diet consumed by nearly everyone in the community. The baking occurred daily, creating the familiar smell that spread through the village each afternoon. The bread would be eaten at meals and then the process would begin again tomorrow. The cycle of grinding, baking, and eating continued without end as long as people lived. Fields were tended with the same care and attention given to them yesterday and before. The crops required water, weeding, and protection from pests to grow successfully toward harvest time. Farmers walked through their fields checking on the condition of plants growing there under their care. The work was repetitive but essential for producing the food that sustained everyone here together. The fields would be tended again tomorrow in the same ways as today just passed. Animals were fed and watered and moved to grazing areas as they had been every day. The animals required daily attention to maintain their health and productivity for the household keeping them. Children guided animals to familiar grazing locations where grass was available for the animals to consume. The animals would return in the afternoon to their enclosures near the home as usual. The care of animals continued day after day in patterns established long ago and maintained. Meals were prepared and consumed at familiar times using ingredients similar to those used before. Families gathered to eat together in the same locations used for previous meals throughout time. The conversations during meals were quiet and focused on simple matters close to daily experience. The meals provided both nutrition and social connection between family members gathered together there. The pattern of meals would repeat tomorrow as it had repeated today and yesterday. Evening brought the transition from work to rest as darkness approached the village and homes. Fires were reduced to coals that would provide minimal warmth through the night ahead coming. Sleeping mats were unrolled and positioned in the same locations used every night without variation. Children settled near parents in arrangements that provided comfort and security during the darkness hours. The household prepared for sleep as the day's activities came to their natural conclusion here. Night brought darkness and the absence of work as people rested on their sleeping mats. The sounds of night replaced the sounds of day as insects and distant animals created their chorus. Most people slept deeply after the physical exertion of the day's labor just completed earlier. The night provided essential rest that allowed recovery of strength for another day of similar work. Sleep came naturally to bodies tired from the familiar patterns of work performed throughout daylight. The stars moved across the sky in patterns that had been observed for countless generations. The moon rose or did not depending on its phase in the monthly cycle repeating. Some people woke briefly during the night before returning to sleep without full consciousness occurring. The hours of darkness passed slowly while most people remained asleep and unaware of passing time. The night served its purpose of providing rest before another day would begin at dawn. Morning would come again bringing light and the beginning of another cycle of daily activities. The sun would rise over the river as it had risen every morning before this one. People would wake and begin their work in fields and homes according to established routines known. The day would unfold in predictable ways shaped by the season and the work required then. The cycle would continue as it had continued for as long as anyone could remember. The river would continue flowing past the village providing water for all the uses needed. Boats would move on the water carrying goods between communities along the river's length as usual. Fish would be caught from the water using nets and traps made by skilled fishermen working. Reeds would be harvested from marshy areas for the many purposes they served in daily life. The river's presence would shape the day as it shaped every day in this place. Fields would be worked according to the needs of crops growing there in the soil prepared. Irrigation channels would be cleared and water flow would be adjusted as required for plant growth. Weeds would be removed and pests would be deterred from damaging the crops being cultivated carefully. The work would continue as it had yesterday and would continue tomorrow after that tomorrow. The agricultural cycles continued through the seasons year after year without end in sight ahead. Women would grind grain and prepare bread as they did each day without exception ever. The repetitive labor would occupy hours of their time as it always had previously before. Children would help with water carrying and other tasks assigned to them by the adults. Families would gather for meals and rest during the hottest hours of the afternoon as needed. The domestic routines would unfold in their customary patterns familiar to all household members there. Craftsmen would work at their various trades producing items needed by the community regularly and continuously. Potters would shape clay and fire vessels in their kilns as they had done before yesterday. Weavers would work at their looms creating cloth from plant fibers gathered and processed earlier in time. Basket makers would weave containers from reeds collected along the river's edge as they always did. The production of necessary items continued steadily to meet the ongoing needs of households requiring them. Elders would sit in shaded areas sharing stories and advice with younger generations around them listening. Their presence would provide continuity and connection to earlier times and past experiences valuable to remember. They would perform light tasks suited to their abilities, contributing what they could to community efforts. The community would care for them as they had cared for others when younger and stronger. The respect for elders would be demonstrated through attention and small acts of service as always. Children would learn through watching and gradually participating in the work around them each day passing. Boys would learn from fathers and male relatives the skills needed for their future work ahead. Girls would learn from mothers and female relatives the domestic skills they would need in life. The education occurred naturally through daily life rather than through formal instruction given in schools. Knowledge and skills passed from generation to generation through this informal but effective method continuing. The sun would rise higher, bringing increasing heat to the villages and fields below them. Work would slow during the hottest midday hours as people sought shade and rest from labor. Activity would resume in the afternoon as temperatures became more tolerable for physical labor again performed. Evening would arrive, bringing cooler air and the completion of the day's required work accomplished. The cycle of the day would move from dawn through midday to evening predictably each time. Trade would occur in designated areas where people brought goods to exchange with others needing them. Farmers would offer grain and vegetables while craftsmen would bring their produced items to trade away. Negotiations would be conducted and exchanges would be completed according to established customs and practices known. The economic life of the community would continue functioning as it had in the past before. The trade provided necessary distribution of goods among those who needed various items regularly for use. The evening meal would be prepared and consumed as darkness approached the village once more again. Families would gather together and share food from common dishes placed in the center for all. The conversations would be quiet and focused on the simple events of the day just completed. The meal would provide nutrition and social connection at the end of another day of work. The cleanup would follow, and then the household would prepare for sleep during the night. Fires would be banked and sleeping arrangements would be made in the same way as every night. Children would settle near parents and the household would become quiet as darkness deepened outside homes. The village would rest as people slept through the hours of darkness until dawn returned once more. The night would provide the necessary rest for bodies to recover for continuing the work required tomorrow. Sleep would come easily to those tired from the day's physical labor just completed earlier today. The patterns would continue without significant change from one day to the next passing by in succession. The work would be performed and the community would maintain itself through collective effort sustained over time. The river would flow and the sun would rise and the seasons would turn through familiar cycles. Life would continue along the river as it had for countless generations before this present time. The rhythms were steady and reliable, providing structure and predictability to existence there in that place. The cycles of life continued turning through the generations living in this place along the river. Children were born and grew to adulthood following the patterns they observed around them daily. Adults formed families and raised their own children in the same ways they had been raised. Elders aged and eventually died to be replaced by the next generation following behind them. The community persisted through time, carried forward by successive generations of people living here together. The knowledge accumulated over generations was preserved through direct transmission from experienced to inexperienced members. Skills were taught through demonstration and practice rather than through written instruction or formal schooling. Each generation learned what the previous generation had learned before them in the same ways. The continuity of knowledge ensured that essential skills were not lost over time passing forward. The informal education system was effective in maintaining the community's ability to survive here successfully. Social bonds connected households to each other through networks of mutual obligation and support created. Families helped each other with tasks requiring multiple people to complete working together efficiently. Food was shared when one household had surplus and another had temporary need requiring help. These reciprocal relationships created safety nets that protected against individual hardship or misfortune encountered. The social fabric was woven through countless small interactions and exchanges occurring daily between people. Religious observances marked important moments in the agricultural calendar and in individual lives passing. Offerings were made at regular intervals expressing gratitude and seeking favor from divine forces believed. Festivals brought communities together for shared celebration and renewal of social bonds connecting them. The religious practices reinforced shared values and provided meaning beyond the daily work performed. The spiritual life was integrated into daily activities rather than separated from ordinary routines followed. The physical environment shaped the possibilities and limitations of life in this river valley region. The river provided water essential for agriculture in an otherwise dry landscape surrounding it completely. The annual flood renewed the soil, making agriculture possible without artificial fertilizers needed for growth. The climate was warm, requiring adaptation in clothing, housing, and daily schedules followed by all people. The environment determined much about how life was lived here in this particular place chosen. Technology available was simple but adequate for the purposes it served in daily work performed. Tools were made from materials available locally or obtained through trade with other communities nearby. The technology had been refined over many generations through trial and experience accumulated over time. Improvements were gradual and built upon what had worked before rather than revolutionary changes introduced. The continuity of technology matched the continuity of other aspects of life lived here together. Economic relationships connected individuals and communities through exchange of goods and services needed by all. Surplus agricultural production was traded for craft goods produced by specialized workers in communities. Markets provided locations where exchanges could occur between people from different areas regularly meeting. The economic system functioned without currency in many transactions, relying instead on direct barter conducted. The economic life supported the community's material needs while reinforcing social relationships between members participating. Political organization provided structure for coordinating activities across multiple communities in the region governed. Officials collected taxes and organized labor for projects benefiting the broader community served by them. The political system required some people to specialize in administration rather than agricultural production directly. The power relationships were hierarchical, with some people having authority over others in the system. The political structure was accepted as necessary for organizing the collective life of many communities. The land was worked by those who lived on it and depended on its productivity for survival. Fields were not owned individually but were allocated to families for their use over time periods. The allocation of land was managed by community leaders or officials according to established customs followed. The relationship to land was based on use and stewardship rather than absolute ownership claimed privately. The land use patterns had developed over generations and were generally accepted by all participants. Buildings and infrastructure were maintained through collective effort rather than individual responsibility alone carried. Irrigation channels served multiple fields and required cooperation to build and maintain over time passing. Temples and public buildings were constructed through organized labor contributed by many community members together. The collective infrastructure supported the community's functioning and could not have been created by individuals acting. The maintenance of shared infrastructure was ongoing work requiring continued cooperation from all benefiting members. Health and well-being depended on adequate nutrition, clean water, and avoidance of accidents when possible. Medical knowledge was limited and many illnesses could not be effectively treated with available remedies known. Infant and child mortality was high and life expectancy was shorter than in later periods. The acceptance of death as natural was necessary given the limitations of medical intervention available then. The community supported those who were ill or injured but could not always prevent death from occurring. The daily experience of most people was shaped by physical labor performed in fields and homes. The work was repetitive and physically demanding, requiring strength and endurance from those performing it regularly. Rest periods were necessary but limited to what was required for recovery and continued work. The relationship between work and survival was direct and understood by everyone participating in it. The necessity of work structured daily life and left little time for leisure or recreation. The village rested in stillness as night deepened over the homes and fields nearby. The breathing of sleepers was slow and regular, creating soft sounds in the darkness. Bodies lay on sleeping mats in positions that had become familiar through countless nights. The darkness surrounded everything and the village was quiet except for occasional distant sounds. The hours of night passed slowly while people slept, unaware of time moving forward. Sleep provided the rest needed for bodies to recover from the day's work performed. The restoration occurred naturally during the hours of darkness when work had ceased completely. Muscles relaxed and breathing slowed as deep sleep took hold of most people resting. The night served its essential purpose, allowing recovery before another day would begin eventually. The sleep was valued as necessary for maintaining the ability to work again tomorrow. The river continued flowing past the village during the night as it always had. The sound of water moving over rocks was soft and constant in the background. The river's presence was felt even during darkness when it could not be seen. The water moved steadily, carrying nutrients and providing the resource that made life possible here. The river would continue flowing through the night and into the day that would follow. Stars remained visible in the sky above, moving slowly through their familiar patterns observed. The positions of stars changed gradually as the night progressed toward the dawn hours. Some people knew the star patterns and could read time's passage from their positions seen. Most people slept and did not observe the stars moving through the darkness overhead. The stars continued their movement regardless of whether anyone watched them pass or not. The moon cast light when present or left darkness more complete when absent from sky. The lunar cycle continued through its phases independent of human observation or need for light. Moonlight filtered through doorways when the moon was visible, providing some illumination inside homes. The moon's presence or absence was noted but did not change the pattern of sleep. The night continued whether moon was visible or hidden from view by its cycle. Animals rested in their enclosures, though some remained partially alert through the night hours. Cattle and goats lay quietly chewing or simply resting in familiar spaces assigned to them. The sounds of animals were part of the night's background, familiar to those sleeping. Dogs remained more alert, watching for any unusual sounds or movements near the village. The animals would rest through the night and resume their activities when morning came. The coolest temperatures occurred in the hours just before dawn would arrive with light. Bodies adjusted naturally, drawing coverings closer during this coolest part of the night cycle. The cooling was gradual and did not wake most people from their sleep, continuing. The temperature would begin rising again when the sun appeared over the horizon eventually. The cycle of cooling and warming repeated each day and night without variation observed. Some people woke briefly during the night for various reasons before returning to sleep. A child might stir and need reassurance from a parent sleeping nearby on mats. An adult might wake to tend the fire or check on animals in enclosures. These brief wakings were normal and did not prevent adequate rest through the night. Most returned to sleep quickly after these brief interruptions and their rest continuing. Dreams might occur during sleep, though they were rarely remembered upon waking in morning. The content of dreams was not considered important or meaningful by most people. Sleep was valued for the rest it provided rather than for dreams accompanying it. The purpose of night was recovery of strength for work rather than dream experiences. Dreams faded from memory quickly once waking occurred and the day began again. The hours of deepest sleep occurred during the middle portion of the night for people. Breathing was slowest and most regular during these hours of complete rest experienced. Movement was minimal as bodies remained still on the sleeping mats beneath them. The deep sleep allowed the most complete recovery from the physical demands of work. The night's deepest hours served the essential function of restoration needed for survival. Very young children slept most soundly and for the longest periods without waking during night. Their bodies required more sleep to support the growth and development occurring within them. Parents positioned themselves near young children to respond if needed during the darkness. The sleep of children was deeper and less easily disturbed than that of adults. Children would wake refreshed and ready for another day of play and learning ahead. Elderly people sometimes experienced less sound sleep and woke more frequently during night hours. The changes in sleep patterns with age were accepted as natural by everyone. Elders rested during the day if nighttime sleep was insufficient for their needs. The community understood that sleep requirements and patterns changed over the course of life. The variations were accommodated without concern or attempts to change what was natural progression. The village remained still as the night hours continued toward the time of dawn. The darkness was nearly complete except for faint light from banked fires still glowing. The sounds of night were familiar and did not disturb those sleeping peacefully in homes. The night served its purpose, providing the rest that would allow work to continue tomorrow. The village rested as it had rested countless nights before this one just passing. Pre-dawn hours brought the first subtle changes, signaling the approaching end of night ahead. The sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east where sun would appear. Birds began their first quiet calls, sensing the coming of day and new light. Most people continued sleeping, unaware of these early signs of dawn approaching gradually now. The transition from night to day was beginning, though darkness still covered the village. The patterns would repeat themselves as they had done yesterday and before that time. Morning would come and people would rise to begin their work in familiar ways. The day would unfold according to the rhythms established over countless generations of living. Work would be performed and meals would be eaten, and evening would arrive once more. The cycle would continue turning as it had always turned in this place here. The sun would rise over the river, bringing light to the fields and homes. Water would be carried and grain would be ground and bread would be baked. Fields would be tended and animals would be moved to grazing areas as usual. Children would play and learn and adults would work at their various tasks assigned. The day would pass in ways that were predictable and familiar to all. Midday would bring heat and the necessary pause from the most strenuous labor performed. People would rest in shade, waiting for the temperature to decrease before resuming work. Afternoon would see the return to tasks as the sun descended toward the western horizon. Evening would bring the completion of work and the preparation for another night of rest. The rhythm of the day would move from dawn through midday to evening as always. Meals would be prepared and consumed at the familiar times with familiar foods eaten. Families would gather together and share food while talking quietly about simple matters. The social connection of eating together was as important as the nutrition provided by food. The meals would follow the same patterns as they had followed before this day. The rhythm of meals marked the passage of time through each day reliably and consistently. Evening would bring the transition from work to rest as it always did daily. Fires would be banked and sleeping mats would be unrolled in the usual places. Children would settle near parents and the household would become quiet as darkness fell. The village would prepare for sleep as another day ended and night approached once more. The preparation for sleep would follow the familiar sequence known to everyone in households. Night would bring darkness and the cessation of work as people rested on their mats. The sounds of night would replace the sounds of day as the village became still. Most people would sleep deeply after the physical work of the day just completed. The night would provide the essential rest needed for recovery before another day of work. Sleep would come naturally to bodies tired from the familiar patterns of labor performed. The patterns would continue day after day through the weeks and months and years. The work would be performed and the community would maintain itself through collective effort. The river would flow and the sun would rise and the seasons would turn. Life would continue along the river as it had for countless generations before. The rhythms were steady and reliable, providing structure to existence in this place here. The cycles would repeat themselves endlessly as far as anyone could see into future. Children would grow and adults would age and elders would eventually pass from life. New children would be born and the community would continue through the generations following. The knowledge would be passed and the skills would be taught and the patterns maintained. The continuity would stretch forward as it had stretched backward into the past remembered. The village would continue existing along the river as it had for a very long time. The homes would be maintained and the fields would be worked season after season ahead. The relationship with the river would remain central to all that was possible here. Life would continue in its established patterns shaped by environment and tradition both together. The community would persist as long as the river flowed and the sun rose daily. The night would deepen as people slept through its hours resting from their labors. The darkness would eventually give way to dawn and another day similar to this one. The sun would rise again over the river, beginning the cycle once more as before. Work would resume and life would continue in its familiar rhythms and patterns known. The days would follow one another in succession, stretching forward through time endlessly ahead. Sleep provided the necessary rest for bodies to recover strength for continuing the work. The night hours allowed for restoration of energy depleted by the day's activities and labor. Dreams might come and go, but the essential purpose was rest and recovery always. The quiet darkness surrounded the village as people rested peacefully in their homes nearby. Morning would come eventually, bringing light and the beginning of another day ahead again. The patterns would repeat themselves day after day through the passing of time forward. The work would continue and the community would maintain itself through collective effort sustained. The river would flow and the sun would rise and the seasons would turn. Life would continue along the river as it had for countless generations before this. The rhythms were steady and reliable, providing structure and predictability to existence there always. The village rested in complete stillness as the deepest part of night held everything. The breathing of sleepers was slow and regular, creating soft sounds barely audible there. The mats beneath them provided cushioning from the floors of mud below their bodies. Bodies had grown accustomed to this through years of sleeping on similar surfaces nightly. Comfort was found more in exhaustion and rest than in softness of sleeping arrangements. Storage jars stood along the walls of homes holding grain and other provisions carefully kept. The jars were sealed to protect contents from moisture and pests during the night. The stored food represented security and survival for the families who depended on these supplies. The preservation of stored food was essential for surviving between harvest periods throughout year. The jars would remain there through the night and into the days that followed ahead. Tools lay where they had been placed after the day's work was completed earlier. They would be taken up again when morning came and work resumed in fields. The tools were simple but essential for the work they were designed to perform. The care of tools was important to everyone who used them regularly in work. The tools rested during the night as the people rested from their labor performed. Woven mats hung on walls or lay folded in corners waiting to be used. The mats served multiple purposes, from sitting surfaces to covers for items needing protection. They wore out from use and needed replacement regularly as part of household maintenance. The skills to make mats were common and materials were readily available from river. Each household produced what it needed or traded with others who specialized in making. Doorways stood open or covered with simple hangings that moved slightly in night breezes. The openings allowed air to circulate through the interior spaces during warm nights. In cooler weather, the openings were covered more completely to retain warmth inside homes. The adjustment of coverings was done according to temperature and comfort needs varying. The homes were designed to accommodate the climate conditions experienced throughout the year here. The night continued holding the village in its darkness and stillness as hours passed. The sleep continued, providing the rest that bodies needed for recovery from work done. The patterns of breathing and occasional movement marked the presence of life continuing through darkness. The village rested as it had rested on countless nights before this one. The night would eventually give way to dawn and the cycle would begin again. Sleeping continued through the hours as darkness covered the village and surrounding fields completely. The rest allowed bodies to heal and restore energy that had been spent working. The stillness was broken only by the soft sounds of breathing and occasional animal calls. The village was at peace during these hours when work had stopped entirely for all. The peace of night was necessary for the continuation of life in this place. Water in storage jars waited to be used when morning came and activities resumed. The water had been carried from the river during the day just passed earlier. It would be used for washing and cooking and drinking when people woke from sleep. The water was essential and always needed in quantities that required constant replenishment from source. The jars held enough water to last through the night until morning fetching began. Fires reduced to coals glowed faintly in the darkness, providing minimal light and warmth. The coals would be used to restart fires in the morning when cooking began. The banking of fires conserved fuel while maintaining the potential for easy relighting later. The skill of fire management was known to all and practiced daily without conscious thought. The fires rested as the people rested, waiting for the new day to arrive. Grain stored in sealed containers waited to be ground into flour tomorrow morning. The grain represented the harvest from fields worked throughout the growing season just past. It would sustain families through the months until the next harvest came around again. The storage of grain was critical for survival during periods between harvests when nothing grew. The containers protected the grain from spoilage and loss that would mean hunger later. Clothing lay folded or hung in homes ready to be worn when people rose. The garments had been made by hand from plant fibers processed over many hours. They would be put on in the morning as part of the daily routine followed. The clothing protected bodies from sun while remaining light enough for the warm climate experienced. The simple garments served their purpose without decoration or unnecessary complexity added to them. Baskets and containers held various household items stored for daily use when needed. The baskets had been woven from reeds gathered along the river and prepared carefully. They would be used tomorrow for carrying, storing, and organizing items throughout the day. The baskets wore out from constant use and were replaced regularly by new ones woven. The skill of basket making was possessed by nearly everyone in the community here. The village slept on as the night progressed slowly toward the dawn hours ahead. The rest continued uninterrupted for most people lying on their mats in homes clustered together. The sleep was deep and restorative, allowing full recovery from the physical demands made. The night protected the sleeping village with its darkness and relative coolness compared to day. The hours passed unmarked by most who slept through them, unaware of their passage. Morning would come as it always came, bringing light and the resumption of work. The sun would rise over the river and people would wake to begin their tasks. The pattern would repeat as it had repeated yesterday and the day before that. The work would be done and the meals would be eaten and evening would come. The cycle would turn again and again without end as far as could be seen. The river would flow and the fields would be tended and the animals would graze. Bread would be baked and water would be carried and children would grow older. Seasons would change and years would pass and generations would succeed one another over time. The village would continue and the patterns would be maintained through the collective effort sustained. Life would go on as it had gone on for longer than anyone could remember.